Great. Welcome. Okay, we're getting ready to start here. I'm Tracy Adler, the Johnson Pote Director of the Wellen Museum of Art at Hamilton College, and the curator of Sarah Oppenheimer Sensitive Machine. We're joined here by the artist, Sarah Oppenheimer, to talk about her exhibition, which opens tomorrow, September 4th, and will run through December 5th. Sarah and I are going to be in dialogue, and then there'll be an opportunity for us to answer questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will hope to get to everyone's queries at the end. So this is a really exciting project. As you can see, for those of you who know the Wellen, the space is more open than it's ever been. This project is probably one of the most challenging projects we've done, but the most exciting project that we've done. Just a little background on the show. I've known Sarah for about 20 years, and basically since I came to the Wellen, she and I have talked about the possibility of her doing a project here. And then in 2017, the stars aligned, and we started to discuss in earnest what a project at the Wellen would look like. We brought Sarah up, showed her the Wellen, took her to some other facilities on campus, including Hamilton's letterpress, where Sarah discovered the printing press and took it apart and was really drawn to one of the elements in the printing press, the screw which drove the printing press. And basically that was kind of a transformational moment that changed the trajectory of your work. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. And then we'll also talk about the specifics of the works here as well.
So to sort of address this history of this exhibition, in 2017, at the time that I arrived for this site visit, I had really spent about a year, 2 years, developing works that were, I think of them as tactile works. And I was very interested in how suddenly, as soon as a work was touched or engaged through a sense of touch, there was a breakdown of a more contemplative viewing distance. And the work somehow became almost like a live wire, where the energy of the body would pass through what was this sort of changing object world and shape the experience both of the viewer, but also of other people existing in the same space. And I started to think about how this tactile quality, there was an immediacy to it, and at the same time, it required this proximity. And I was looking for a way to extend that reach so that it would almost like stretch that fabric of that medium, of that wire, of that object. And I was looking to find a way to have motion, the motion of the hand, of the human hand, extend through that object into other objects or into other aspects of space, almost as if it was sort of jumping through this gap, the gap, a kind of spatial gap from one body to another body. So at the time that I visited the Wellen, I was looking for mechanical systems that could be driven by a human being or a human motor, as I like to think of it. And I was looking for mechanical systems whereby a rotational input would create some sort of perpetual oscillation at a remote distance. And the thing that was so remarkable was that when we visited the letterpress studio, I noted that there was an ink distribution system in the press where if you just turn the hand crank, the ink roller would shuttle back and forth in order to spread the ink out on the press. And it was that system that we took apart and basically dissected. And I've spent the last, I suppose, several years dissecting the system, which I like to think of as a kind of clock or some sort of timekeeper, and also some sort of control system where there's a feedback between the action or the gesture of the body and this mechanism, which creates a phased oscillation in a larger system. So this project grew in a way out of trying to apply this sort of embodied time scale to a larger array of architectural, not objects, but infrastructures, such that the energy of a person would activate a much sort of greater scale of space. And not just space, but sort of the space envelope objects that we contact. And that's by and
how we
large
got
how
here.
we got here.
So there's 4 interdependent instruments, and we'll get to why we call them instruments a little bit later. And so you'll see that there are 4 inputs, and they all have a different trajectory, which is also really exciting because the audience member has to come in and activate it and learn what that program is. And then there's also the unique addition of moving lights, which is, this is the first time you've done that in your work.
That's right, yes.
So should we ask some of our student docents to help us move some objects here?
Wonderful.
Okay, we are really grateful to have 4 of our incredible Welland student docents here to help us out. So Henry, do you want to come on in and move number 2? So we're going to move some of these, the ones in the foreground, we're going to move them independently, and then we'll move all 4. You get a sense of the scale of the space and the scale of the instruments, both based on the view that you're seeing of the whole gallery, but also on relative size to Henry's scale. So you're seeing some of the panels move back and forth and some of the lights move up and down. Thank you, Henry.
So
All right.
we can have
Let's
Emma.
have Emma. Emma, can you come in and move number 1? Thank you, Emma. So is there anything that you want to talk about specifically as these are moving, or do we just want people to experience them as they're moving?
Well, I think it's very interesting to imagine. There's a very different experience, I believe, sitting in front of a computer screen
Right.
and watching things on this wide angle lens and being in this space.
Right.
One of the things that's been very important to me is to have the instruments activate non-contiguous elements. So in that sense, the instrument number 1, or network 1, actually, it's not instrument number 1, but network 1 is, input 1 is driving the lower volume of the nearby, of the lower, below that input, the upper white volume, and then a pair of lights. And actually, Henry, if you could activate number 2 at the same time now, you'll see that Henry, as Henry starts to engage with the work, other lights begin moving. And these sort of overlaps create a kind of question as to how your gesture, if you're in this space, creates an effect. And it also creates a challenge for people at a greater viewing distance, a very different relationship, which is, I would hope, a relationship of people trying to build sort of sequences and networks, maps within their mind of how things are linked and uncoupled. So maybe we should have 3 and 4 come in now.
3 and 4, Amanda and Kaylee. So now we'll be moving all 4. And so part of this is also about the agency of the individual, but also group dynamics as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that's been critical to your practice for a while now.
So I think that, and this is something very exciting for me with this project, which is there's something really amazing that happens when you're very close to something, that you lose track of how you are affecting that which you're contacting. You can't, for example, when you're walking through a doorway, that doorway suddenly at that point of compression where you pass through, you lose understanding of the sort of surrounding space, and you simply become aware of the sort of extent of that doorway and its affordance to your body. And there's something amazing about this space being so open, because suddenly you're able to think about your relation and others' relation to the objects or the, let's say, the infrastructure of that space. And it suggests in a certain way a very complex relationship, both of a self-awareness, but an awareness of other people. And I think that that is both a group, it's a kind of collaborative group question. It's also a question of situating yourself and identifying yourself within a larger social field, understanding yourself, and also a non-social field, a mechanical field. There's a sort of blurring of the boundary of you and the room, you and the machine, you and the instrument.
Near and far.
Yeah, near and far. And to say something else about the lights that I'm really excited about is that the lights work in a way like a signal, in that it signals a kind of motion that I think something less glaring, and to use the word glaring, I actually mean high contrast, a visual high contrast.
Literal glare.
Yeah, a literal glare, it would not be possible without that. So there's something very, very interesting about that. And yesterday, in fact, Kaylee, the operator of number 3, pointed out something that I was very excited about. And I've been very excited because this is all brand new to all of us, to me. Kaylee pointed out that she noticed that it may be not just that these, let's say, lights and volumes are moving as a result of the inputs, but that perhaps the wall's moving or a mount on the ceiling is moving. And so there was a blur of what was actually changing and what wasn't changing. And I think that that's very interesting to me, and it has to do with the scale and slowness of the motion. The fact that things are moving so slowly and also in such a kind of tight tolerance, tight range, suggests that other things may also be moving that we don't notice.
Right. And that was something that was really exciting. So yesterday we brought in a group of our Hamilton student docents and just allowed them to experience the space, and watching that process of discovery was probably one of the coolest things, to see how people naturally, undirected, start to interact with the elements. They start to figure out that there are things that you can move, and that not only is that generating movement elsewhere, but the lights, the discovery of the lights was almost like also a wave through the group where they were like, oh, and the lights are moving too. Do you want to talk a little bit about that idea of discovery and play and that kind of interactive element that's so critical?
So I think that it's almost a hard thing to discuss. I do think that there's a way that I like the possibility of a work remaining totally open. And by open, I mean there is room for a person to situate themselves in the work, not so much as a meaning generator, but as a place and a space of sort of orienting themselves in the world. And part of orienting oneself in the world, I feel, has to do with both unlearning that which we already know, and then refamiliarizing ourselves to it or with it, so that we become suddenly much more sensitive to our environment. And in that way, I think play, a kind of generous, open-ended play, offers a way of doing that that's really unique and also joyous and critically important.
So talking about play, if you can just talk about we call them instruments, you call them instruments, you know. So obviously, when you think about an instrument, you think about, you have to play it, so you have to activate it. But also it's kind of like it's a vehicle for channeling activity. Do you want to just talk for you about what that means to you and why you came up with that terminology?
So the term instrument, by and large, grew out of an interest in how these operate as mechanical infrastructure. And increasingly, I wanted the mechanism to be invisible so that a visitor, viewer, a person could learn the behavior of the mechanism rather than focus on a larger mechanical system. And at the same time, I wanted to emphasize the fact that that internal time-based system was the work. And the term, therefore, instrument, in some ways, it almost stripped bare, to use, to refer to one of my more favorite works. It stripped bare the kind of shell or the skin of the system and pointed towards that internal structure, that internal mechanism.
So I just want to take a moment for those of you who are just joining us, just to mention, I'm Tracy Adler, the director of the Wellen, and I'm here with artist Sarah Oppenheimer. We're talking about her exhibition, Sarah Oppenheimer Sensitive Machine, which opens tomorrow and will run through December 5th. And once again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them. So I also want to talk about architecture, because it was because of the architecture of this building and this open plan of the Dietrich Exhibition Gallery that I thought would be so exciting to have you engage with. And architecture is such a driving force in your work that I want to be sure that, especially for those who are less familiar with it, that we talk about it in an important way.
So this work is entirely calibrated to the underpinning rules of this space. And those rules are not necessarily visible. It's not about the surfacing of the floor. It's not about the color of the wall. It has everything to do with what I see as the distribution of the regular distribution of different structural and mechanical systems that underlie the building. And the lights, therefore, became really critical. You'll notice that the lighting is very regular. The lighting tracks are every 10 feet in the building. We've staggered them every other track is a track that is now on or engaged. And the instruments bridge the tracks such that the movement actually shuttles between the extent so that they sort of hug and come close to these moving lights, and then they move away and they hug and come close to another light. And that rhythm and that phasing and that extent and range of motion is driven by the rules of the space. And those rules historically in my work have been critical to thinking through how we occupy space, what sort of games and social systems are afforded by a space and what are constrained by space. There's a yeah.
But I think what's also interesting is that you are both responding to architecture and thinking about architecture and thinking about how architecture impacts us. But the work itself sort of turns that upside down, like how we impact the architecture that we pass through. You think about like a archaeological site where like the steps have been worn from centuries of people's passage. And that's what I think that's really interesting about your work, because it doesn't just posit how architecture limits or defines us, but how we can actually be an agent in changing that.
Yes, and actually something that has been a long interest of mine is this idea of boundaries, and how boundaries are in some ways a sort of recurring theme architecturally. And for years I have thought of boundaries as a kind of play of enclosures or play of adjacencies. And that notion in this instance has been, I'd say, radically upended, in that the boundary is now no longer the solid wall or the ceiling or the floor, which divides space A from space B. Rather, it's that space in between, that unfilled, what we imagine as unfilled open space. So it's the space between our bodies, it's the space between ourselves and the doorway, our hand and the doorknob. That space is the boundary that defines the difference or the separation between us, our separateness. And I'm really excited about how this work starts to play with kind of expanding and shrinking and or contracting and expanding that zone of space that has no footprint.
Right. And it also helps us think about like the impact just sort of beyond our body, the impact elsewhere in the gallery. And what's also exciting is when we get a group of people together and they're moving the instruments, like our docents were just moving it now, it is kind of like symphonic, right? There is this whole, it's like one instrument might start, a second comes in, and then, you know, you sort of have a crescendo when they're all operating together. So talk about how you think about them as independent works and how you think about them as interdependent works.
So each instrument has a set of rules in some ways that define it. And those are qualities that define it. And the qualities that define it are inscribed both in the body of the instrument, but also in the name of the instrument, in the title of the instrument. And the instruments are largely defined by their number of inputs, their number of outputs, and the specific motion, range of motion, and most importantly, the number of phased elements, how many time phases are overlapping or orchestrated by that machine. In addition to that specific quality of the instrument, each instrument also has a network ID. And that's another number that sort of follows the first number as a title. And that second network ID points towards the fact that all these instruments start to link together. So they exist as autonomous in some ways, not exactly autonomous, but discrete systems.
Right.
And the discrete systems then link together into larger networks. And those larger networks can overlap. And then the discrete elements can come apart. And they can be networked elsewhere in different configurations with different skins.
Which is cool. So I also want to, you know, obviously a lot of this project was developed during COVID, and it's very responsive to it too. And a number of our docents were saying yesterday, being able to touch things, being able to move things, being able to engage communally has been really rewarding. But we have obviously spent a lot of time talking throughout COVID about how this time allowed you to develop this project and how the project might be different had you not had that time in the studio to develop it.
So one thing that's been amazing about developing this work is that I've increasingly tried to bring things close to hand in my making of them. And that is not about, let's say, the machining of a plate. That is about understanding how the instrument feels. How does it feel when you're sort of, and what is that gesture that's involved? And that has meant that over the last year and a half, I really had a lot of time to play with reducing friction in the system, dealing with the range of motion involved, swapping out components so that things are behaving differently, not so that they look differently. Ultimately, we know, or I know, it's going to be a light bulb in a white box. But actually, it has everything to do with that kind of the time motion, the way something moves. And I think that the thing that's been so incredible is that I've been able to slow that process down hugely, such that I can really build into the studio a practice of almost kind of recursive practice, practicing and practicing and practicing, almost like practicing scales.
Right.
To learn how the system will behave. And that's just, it's amazing then to see these things moving at this scale with multiple operators and multiple kind of overlapping systems, and think about that other time of sort of rehearsing this outside of this space.
Yeah, it's the sensitive machine.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the title, because the title was something we talked about for a long time. And it came up because there was a class that you were teaching at Yale that you called Sensitive Machine. And, we think of, we are sensitive machines, but also imparting that kind of same sensitivity to the machines themselves, I think is part of the dialogue or the dialectic that you're setting up. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about it.
So I was very interested in developing this workshop, and the workshop that I had been thinking about and exploring had to do with the possibility of extending the gesture, so that an individual would, a participant in this workshop would build a kind of extended prosthetic that would attach to the body, and they would create a sort of gestural arc. And I started to ask others to come up with ways of having that single gesture controlled by different people, so that let's say the gesture of one person's arm would be controlled by the movement of another person's arm. And rather than think of that as a single object controlled by two bodies, I wanted to learn how to think of that body as having a new boundary. So the body then held multiple bodies and this sort of bridging prosthetic. And to do that, we dove into a large motion capture studio where we could attach sensors to the body in different locations. And the sensors that were then distributed would create digital models of hybridic bodies, where the body became merged with this mechanized object in this sort of cyborgian.
It's less finite in a way, because it's not just the single body.
That's right.
Yeah, it's more cyborg.
That's right. And I think that it was notable to me that there was a process, not just of learning because it was a pedagogical situation, but that learning became the way that that body became inhabited. And I wanted to therefore embrace that learning possibility as a sort of format for thinking through how one might enter this work.
And that's kind of similar, like you develop this digitally, these projects digitally, but then they're manifest physically in real space. So you want to talk a little bit about, how those two realms coexist in your work?
Yeah, I think that the work evolves in many ways, and there's almost I'm constantly looking to find a tool through which to understand what I am doing. But there are so many tools that approximate something that are not that thing. So the digital is one such tool. One of the advantages of the digital is that in making a digital model, you not only have that model, but that model becomes the tool pathing for a machined object. And it also can simulate different forces or frictions or light scenarios that don't output into that object, but can specify that which you need to obtain a certain kind of outcome. And so there's a lot of fusing and trying to understand how something will behave that requires a lot of shifting from one mode of representation to another mode of representation. And the digital tool is yet another mode of representation that is sort of integrated.
Right. So I think we're at a point where we are going to welcome some questions.
You seem to be interested in the idea of play. Are there any experiences or objects from your life experience that inform your interest in this idea of play?
So the question is for Sarah, and it's about the idea of play and any kind of past experiences that have informed that idea.
I think that each work that I make is an experiment. And so as I enter a work that I have made and I watch others inhabit that work, that becomes a huge learning experience for me. So for example, last night, watching the docents start to touch and turn and learn this piece was one of the most playful, amazing experiences I've had in years.
Question for Sarah. Can you talk about your choice of materials, and is there any relationship to the fact that humans are going to touch them?
So the question is about Sarah and the use of materials, which I think is a great question because we should also talk about aspects of this are custom and they're highly customized. And then some of it is material that's off the shelf that you have customized to build. So that's a great question about the materials that are involved in making this piece.
Yeah, there are many answers to that. I think extensively about materials. I like the idea of materials being camouflaged so that we think of them as generic, such as linear light bulbs and gallery walls. And in that case, the materials are very specific to that sort of pre-existing qualities of a space. There are other materials that are hyper-functional, which are not visible. They're extraordinarily customized, which are not visible. Those materials are buried inside the work. And if you were in this room, there are these long slots. You can look up into the piece and see the mechanism if you're standing below it. But by and large, they're not at all apparent. In a kind of more zoomed out way, there's another very important aspect to these materials, and it has to do with time. I'm very interested in how there is a temporality to our gesture that we experience as familiar and living. And there's also a quality of the materials here, specifically, I'd say a kind of coldness and a rectilinear sort of alienness, non-organicness that is very intentional. And there's something that happens when that architecture world takes on the temporality of the human being and the motion of the human being, where it starts to become almost like a living building, and we perceive it differently through the time scale of its motion.
Yeah, it's very geometric. You know, everything is hard edges and clean edges. For those who are interested in how they can see some of the inner components, they can watch the video that we produced, which is on our website. And what's cool about that is that you get to see the prototypes. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about the prototypes and how critical they are to you working out these ideas. There is this kind of digital where you're, you know, experimenting, but then you always prototype your work before envisioning it in the final form.
So the prototypes are ever more important in my thinking, because they are the process through which I am able to understand how something behaves and how something moves and changes in time. They are not visual tools. They are tactile tools, they're haptic tools, they're kinematic tools, they're time tools. And they're not only time tools, but they are actually one-to-one maps. Actually, they are the components that are within these structures. So the prototypes are a way that I learn, they're the way that I'm developing the piece, they're the way that I am making the work. And they are also immediately ready to hand, meaning I can manipulate them manually and sense the result. I've been thinking a lot about making a drawing. And when you make a drawing, you put a mark on a page, and then you respond to that mark very immediately. And there's a real beauty of that kind of feedback that starts to happen between the maker of the drawing and the drawing itself as it accrues, as it changes in time. And the prototypes do that.
Mhm.
And that's
They're like
why
drawings.
yeah, they have that dynamic
Mm.
changing.
Right.
Question for Sarah. Can you talk about any of the specific constraints of this space at the Welland that informed your decisions about how the objects would move or where they were placed?
So that's a question for Sarah about the objects specifically in the space, how the artworks operate here, some of the constraints of the architecture. We learned a lot about the architecture and the infrastructure of this building when we were doing this piece, you know, climbing up in the ceilings, understanding what's under the floors. So it'd be great for you to talk about that.
So this piece is entirely dependent on the structure of the space. The space has a very regular underlying structural grid, underlying electrical grid, and and each aspect of this piece, the proportion of each element, the repetition, its position in space, its orientation to the egress, has everything to do with these different rhythmical and repetitive structures. Most of these structures are not visible, but I would argue that these are the primary, actually haptic experiences we have of a space without necessarily knowing it. And so to be very specific, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I want to be as specific as possible about it. You'll notice there's a regular lighting grid. The lighting grid is important on many levels. That lighting grid is it's offset with a structural grid, so that means that the primary supports, these large steel trusses that are sitting in the ceiling here, are sort of staggered in between the lighting grid. And so we were basically thinking about how we would bridge across the electrical grid in order to support these elements, which are both suspended from this structural ceiling and from the floor below, such that each instrument could sit centered on a lighting track, and thereby, as it would slide from side to side, would sort of come very close to this descending light, and then would return in its oscillation to become very close, opposite side of its travel, to another light as those lights were rising and falling. And that internal relation to the building is the logic of this work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would also say, like, you know, it's not just you as the artist, but that this project necessitated architects and engineers to realize, and it was a real it was a real communal effort, not only on the part of those who were involved in the physical manifestation of the piece, but your involvement with literally everyone here at the Welland, the entire staff. Like, we all were probably more involved because of the requirements of this piece and just how the haptic relationship that it has, in a way that I've never really seen before, which was really exciting too. So not only does it engage the entirety of the space and the infrastructure of the space, it also engages the infrastructure of the entire Welland staff too. So the people and the place.
Question for Sarah. What have you learned about your work by reinstalling certain pieces in multiple locations?
So the question is for Sarah, and it's about what she has learned from installing specific pieces in different places, multiple places. So maybe like the Mass MoCA piece, the piece that's in Mass MoCA, which was developed at the Wexner.
I learned, so there have been many pieces that have had cycles through different locations. And I think that I learn a lot about the perceptual register of the work, because I'm less dependent on some of the infrastructural concerns. And so I start to become very aware of how the position of work relates to our perception of ourselves, our perception of the space we're in. And I think that that's been a really fascinating thing. So for example, if you take the same work and you turn it from a 90 degree, from a horizontal to a vertical, and we're a person is walking past it, there's a very different duration of looking that happens if you're looking at something that's vertical versus horizontal, because the horizontal, it lasts longer as you process. And so there's a kind of exaggerated time scale. And all of those things, let's say it's orientation in space, it's orientation in terms of a light source, it's if it is somehow affecting light source, all of those things just change from space to space.
Question for Tracy. We heard a little bit about your relationship with Sarah. What made you inspired to bring this to people?
Okay, so the question is for me, and it's about why this exhibition here in Hamilton. So I've known Sarah for 20 years, and I curated her into a couple of group shows in New York City. But when we first met, it was when you were at the Marie Walsh Sharp studio program. And I remember in your studio, you had set up basically an architectural interaction where you come in and the space itself kind of records your interaction. So it changes based on how people interacted with it. It was almost like an advent calendar, if that's kind of the best way I could describe it. And it was unlike anything I had ever seen. And then Sarah and I started talking. And, you know, I did curate her into a couple of group shows, and she made these amazing works for that. But then when I came to Hamilton, and actually it was even when I knew that I was coming here and I had you know, been in these architecture meetings and knew what the facility was going to look like and knew all of these really interesting architectural details about the Welland. So we have these 27-foot soaring glass cases. We have this huge open plan gallery. There's so much glass throughout the museum. It's really, all the inner workings of the museum are made transparent. I just knew that Sarah would do something responding to this architecture that would be really interesting. And so, like I said, like immediately when I came here, we started having those conversations. And then, you know, 5 years later, the time was right for us to really plan in earnest.
Follow-up question for Tracy. We heard that the time during COVID was helpful. What was it like for you as a director trying to work out these projects during the pandemic?
Okay, so the question was about working out on this project during the pandemic. So what's unique is that I would say, for me, usually I spend a lot of time with artists in their studio. And so that wasn't really possible. So of course we had regular calls and, you know, virtual meetings, and that was really helpful. And I think it necessitated a lot more conversation because I wasn't there in the studio able to experience that. But we talked a lot about the impact in general, like this idea of touch, which I think we were also removed from. We knew when we were planning it, you know, we hoped we would be at a point where we would be able to have visitors, and we are at that point where we can have vaccinated guests who are masked visiting. And it was this kind of the idea of joyously reconnecting through touch. So I think we kept our eye on the prize the whole time. And we knew that once it was made manifest, there would be something really rewarding about it, because we understood that we were all striving for touch and striving to connect with each other. So it was hard, and it was I would say a non-traditional way of doing things, but in the end it ended up being great. And then Sarah was here for the last 2 months plus, so that was really unique too, having her here, having her, you know, literally touching every part of the creation of this piece was also incredible. And that was kind of an extension of the COVID experience.
We've heard some of Sarah's influences. Question for Sarah: are there specific artists that have influenced you, if it's Duchamp specifically on this?
So the question is for Sarah, artists that have influenced her, and is Duchamp perhaps one of those influences?
Yes, so clearly, I've long been interested in Duchamp for many reasons, in many ways. But I've also been interested in, there's a really wide range of artists that I've been thinking about recently. I would say I've been thinking a lot about Lygia Clark. I've been thinking about Senga Ngudi. I've been thinking about the work of Stephen Willits. I've been thinking about all sorts of things. And I think that something that has really shaped where I'm looking in terms of art is I'm looking at artists who are thinking of artwork as a kind of living exchange, and a living exchange that's not about a kind of research document, but a living exchange that's actually a kind of embodied transmission between. And that's really directed where I'm thinking.
Question for Sarah. Can you talk a little bit about your ideas of interactivity between the analog and digital?
So this is a question for Sarah about the interaction between analog and digital. We talked about it a little bit, but I think it bears you sort of expanding on.
So to step back from that question
Yeah.
a little, I am interested in increasingly not using the term digital, but using the term discrete. So what is the difference between a discrete system and an analog system? And I like to think of that in terms of time, ways we measure or embody time. That if we think of a clock, it could break time into discrete units, ones and zeros, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Or we could think of time as a sort of continuous flow. And I think of this work is all about an analog time, not a discrete time. At the same time, we're living in a moment, in a discrete universe. We're living in a moment where all time is passing through this media and medium, which breaks things down into discrete packets, into units, into zeros and ones, and then spits them back out as if they have remained a kind of continuous elastic surface. And I think this work in some ways is a product of that sort of processing and cannibalizing, where it becomes discrete, it becomes analog, it becomes discrete, it becomes analog. But it is also about wanting to embody the analog, wanting to embody the continuity, the continuous, the non-discrete temporality.
And what's cool about these pieces too is that they're all mechanical, like there's nothing electrical. So it's kind of funny. We have to like do a power shutdown. And at first I was like, oh, but what about the pieces? And I'm like, the pieces will be fine because they are in that way independent, you know?
Yes, and something so amazing about what it offers by being let's say, powered by a human motor,
Right.
is that we have such a sort of infinite number of permutations available of the positional, cyclical overlaps. As soon as we have only 4 inputs, but we have 15 outputs, and those outputs, I mean, actually we have far, far more outputs, and those outputs have cycles and phasing, they have acceleration and deceleration as they carriage through returns at different positions. And so the sort of overlay of all of the different possibilities becomes just extremely, extremely rich.
Question for Sarah. Can you offer any thoughts on the idea of buildings as living organisms?
Question for Sarah on thoughts about the building as a living organism.
I have so many thoughts about that. I think that there's something really amazing about how everything is always changing and moving in response to everything else. And part of what is so striking is that we have a certain range of perceived change, so that if something is happening at a speed, at a scale that's either very, very quick or very, very slow in relation to the human time scale, it falls out of our range of perception. And I think there are many artworks that operate sort of as examples of these different timescales. But buildings, by and large, unless they are sort of crumbling in front of us, they change very slowly. You'll have constant fluctuation of the ceiling, constant fluctuation of the floor. As the air cools outside, different things are happening inside of our walls. There is so much movement all around us, but its duration is such that we mostly don't notice it. So I think of buildings as alive in the sense that they are always in flux and in a kind of responsive flux to everything else. I think the whole notion of what qualifies as a living being is a very contentious and open-ended question. And I think that there's been some really amazing writing about the possibility of the technical object as it evolves towards the living being. And it's a wide open field.
Question for Sarah. What is how do you view the element of sound?
So the question is for Sarah about the element of sound in her work. So obviously touch is really important, sight is really important, but sound is also a component as well. So
yes, sound is so important in this work. I think that, as I was saying earlier, it's very important that things move very slowly within a certain range of motion, a kind of slowed down range, because it makes you aware, it makes you sensitive to motion. And also it suggests that possibly things that are still are in fact moving. I think sound in some ways operates in a similar way. If something is very, very sort of quiet or almost audible, it makes you more sensitive to very slight sound. These elements, they make sound. They're just very, very, very quiet. You put your ear to them and you'll hear something. And in that sense, they're not without sound and they're not with sound. They're making mechanical energy, which is a sound wave, and that's a beautiful thing. The other thing I will say is that one of the custom elements is this internal timekeeper, this cam that has a helical shape inscribed on its surface. And if you unroll this, or if you were to make a rolling kind of print of this, that helical surface would become a sine wave. And I think of that sine wave as a score, which is a temporal score of change, and it could also be considered a sound-based, an audible score.
Question for Sarah. How are you influenced by the ideas of everyday human rituals, movement, or even dance?
So this is a question for Sarah about ritual movement, dance, interaction. And we're actually going to have a couple of Hamilton classes who are going to be doing performances here that are responding directly to the instruments. So there's a theater class as well as a dance class. So we're really excited about what that experiment is going to look like. But yeah, we'd love to hear from your perspective. And I know that you collaborated with the theater department and engineering and other departments when you've been at Yale as well. But it'd be great to hear what you think about that.
So I feel that there's a very, very large history of dance with many sort of conflicting and contentious and exciting positions, much of which I don't know. So I remain ignorant of. However, I will say, in terms of gestural motion, I am interested in the habitual gestural motions, in part because they have become so embodied by us that we are not in any way surprised when they start to merge with the simple technologies around us. And I really think of a handle, a door handle, as a beautiful moment, because we understand that the turning of a door handle, when we perceive it from elsewhere, implies that there is a hand beyond our field of vision, turning that handle. It suggests to us that another exists. Just as when we turn it, we somehow know without knowing that as we turn it, we will open or close a space beyond us. And there's no thought in some sense that is accompanying this habitual action. And that's part of the beauty. So I think that there's something very key to the way that I want these pieces to operate. I want to both defamiliarize and familiarize. And that habitual motion, learning those habitual interactions we have with our environment become very important to thinking about how these might operate.
Do you think of that as ritual, or do you think of that as distinct from ritual? Habitual action.
I don't think of that as ritual. I think of that as a learned instinctive response. Ritual seems, I have to think about it, but ritual seems somehow embedded with certain, I'm not sure what I think of ritual.
Yeah.
Second to last question. For Sarah, what excites you most about working with students, and or what are you looking forward to working with him?
Okay, this is our second to last question, and it's asking Sarah what she's excited about in terms of interacting with our students and faculty. We've already had great conversations. Alexander Jarman, our assistant curator, has already had great conversations with art and art history, as well as sociology, psychology, women and gender studies, theater, dance. And so, we're a liberal arts institution. Obviously, one of the big parts about doing that show, your show here, is that interactive component that we're going to have cross-curricularly. So do you mind just to talk about what you're excited about in there?
I think pedagogy is a fascinating field. I think I think teaching and learning are highly undervalued. I also think that it becomes a primary way that we come to know others, and it's a primary way that we come to know the world. And I am really excited to come to know, for myself, to come to know this piece through the eyes of others and through the questions that others are posing here. And I am also incredibly excited to think about how this work might register beyond its own footprint as I begin to engage with these students and as these students begin to teach me things.
Yeah, I think we're all going to learn a lot.
Yeah.
Our last question is from Sarah.
Last question from Sarah's dad.
Towards what sort of developments do you see yourself going from here?
That's a great question. Towards what sort of developments do you see yourself going from here? Because this sort of has created new possibilities in your work so dramatically.
We will see.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Sarah, for being in dialogue. We hope that you will come tomorrow. We're having an open house from 1 to 5 here at the Wellen. We hope you'll come and experience the Sensitive Machine, as well as we will have some refreshments out on the museum terrace. For those of you who aren't able to join us, please continue to check our website. We build content there and on our social media sites. So, please follow us, and definitely check out the video that was created by Brett Novak of Sarah's process in the lead up to this project, because it really provides a lot of insight. Thanks so much for being with us, Sarah.
Thank you.